The Paterson strike of 1913 is one of the most famous in American history. It was the high water mark of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. Led by Carlo Tresca, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, and Big Bill Haywood, the IWW was coming off a major victory in the textile mills of Lawrence, Massachusetts, and was poised to challenge the American Federation of Labor for the leadership of the labor movement. But that's only part of the story.
There's a long history of conflict in the silk industry before the IWW was ever heard of in Paterson. I mean, Paterson was known as Silk City, of course. Less famously, it was known as Red City, which didn't mean the Bolsheviks. This was 1890. It meant the Paris Commune. It meant radical, uncontrollable elements. This was not a flattering term.
The Paterson strike of 1913 was the culmination of almost 90 years of strikes in the city's textile and silk mills.
Despite Alexander Hamilton's vision of Paterson as the industrial city, Paterson is in many ways a throwback. Its industrialization is in many ways delayed because silk came to predominate, and silk depends on skilled laborers. And striking is seen almost from the beginning in the silk industry in Paterson as a normal way of doing business from a worker's point of view, not from the boss's point of view. But you strike when the boss most needs you in the busy season, spring and fall, and you walk out and you don't expect to be out very long. You don't try and get the whole industry to go out with you. It's usually a single shop or a few shops striking at a time. It's not heavy on coordination. It just relies on the fact that the boss really needs you and can't replace you because you're skilled.
Paterson is the epitome of an immigrant city. Its successive wave of immigrants, English, French, German, Italians, Jews from Russia and Poland, bring with them their own expectations about worker control in the workplace, traditions of labor organization, and a belief in socialism and social justice.
The nature of work and the nature of life, and the vision of Paterson workers is radical from the beginning and increasingly radicalized within the silk industry. I mean, we're just talking the silk industry. And whether it's socialism, anarchism, or the IWW, which had elements of both, or no ism at all. This is a very red city, as it was aptly called before the Italians and Jews started coming in large numbers and made it more so.
While the Germans and the Jews were generally socialist, the northern Italians have a tradition of anarchism.
That you weren't going to be submissive to the church, you weren't going to be submissive to the state, and you weren't going to be submissive to the boss.
The violent dyers' strikes of 1902 shut down the city's dye shops, but the weavers stayed at their looms. The weavers went out on strike in 1911, but the dyers did not go out. In 1913, they went out together and shut down an entire city.
But of the 25,000 people working in the silk industry, 23,000 went out.
For the weavers, the principal issue was the plan by the massive new Doherty mill to require them to work 4 looms instead of 2, a practice that could cost thousands of workers their jobs.
The objectives of the strike was to get rid of the 4 looms. They went from 2 looms to 4 looms, all right, which meant that it required greater concentration, greater physical exertion, and 4 looms as opposed to 2, that meant that so many workers would not be needed. So that if you strike or if you demand higher wages, goodbye, we've got all of, as Marx would put it, the reserve army of the unemployed, okay? So they want to get rid of the 4-loom system. They want an 8-hour day, right? They want minimum pay of $25 a week for the dyers' helpers. And they want a 25% increase across the board for everybody else.
Dissatisfied with their prior representation by a socialist Labor Party union, the Paterson workers went on strike and then invited in the IWW to help provide the coordination and leadership they knew they would need to win the biggest strike in Paterson's long labor history.
The local chapter of the IWW that was formed in Paterson was a direct outgrowth of all the years of organizing of the same leaders and the same notions, just with the IWW label. And so when these stars came to town, there was already a going chapter of the IWW formed by the same people who had been organizing for years and fighting back for years, in that they picked up on the situation, and there was local Paterson silk weavers like Lessig and Ketkin, who had been traditional leaders of their crafts, who continued to function in that way within the IWW-led strike.
Founded in 1905, the IWW under Haywood sought to organize all workers, skilled and unskilled, immigrant and native-born, black and white, women and men. Their goal was to organize an uprising from below that would ultimately overthrow the capitalist system and create a socialist workers' state.
Flynn did everything. Right? She was the principal strike leader in the Paterson strike of 1913.
Her speaking ability, her fire in her belly, the rebel girl. She would go in front of crowds, and the minute she opened her mouth and the words came out, people listened, people were inspired, and people knew that she had the strength that she carried over from the 1912 strike, the Lawrence strike, the strike of bread and roses. They had faith in her. That's why they turned to the Wobblies. They felt that she was going to help them win this strike as she helped those other workers a year earlier.
Women played a leading role in the Paterson strike. Margaret Sanger, who would later found Planned Parenthood, organized an exodus of children of strikers to New York City to be cared for by strike sympathizers, and was later arrested in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, trying to persuade silk workers there to go out in support of the Paterson strikers. Flynn inspired young women like Carrie Golzio and Hannah Silverman to take a leadership role.
But Carrie had a lot of guts. She came forth. She would wear her red ribbon around her neck. She'd be in front of her mill as her boss would be looking at her, and she'd show him that red ribbon and had no fear. She was very talented. She played the guitar. She sang music. She had a 4-year-old son who she would bring here for the strike meetings, and she had the gumption and the fortitude to just move forth and fight. That was her word. We're going to fight. We're not going to stay home. We're going to fight. So she's one of the heroes of this story.
Paterson police made hundreds of arrests, but throwing workers from many mills and nationalities together into jail cells just strengthened their solidarity. 2 strikers were shot by private detectives hired by mill owners, but the strikers used the funeral to build popular support. 3 months into the strike, authorities decided to close down the strikers' meeting halls and to ban freedom of speech and freedom of assembly in Paterson. IWW leader Patrick Quinlan's response was, "On to Halden." Located across the river from Paterson, Halden had a socialist mayor who welcomed the strikers. And Pietro and Maria Botto, whose 4 daughters all worked in the silk mills, offered their home with its 2nd-floor balcony facing a large green as a meeting place. Every Sunday, thousands of strikers gathered at the Botto House to listen to speakers in every language, urging solidarity in their cause.
125,000 people who lived in Paterson in 1913. 73,000 lived in families with somebody living in the silk mills. So the impact on the city is just overwhelming. I mean, landlords are not collecting rents, and they're not evicting. It's just it's the city, as you know, merchants are giving credit. Some are actively supporting the strike.
Keeping the strike going was a challenge, despite strong support from the Sons of Italy, Jewish organizations, local bakeries, and money raised by the IWW and supporters in New York. To raise money, the strikers decided to stage a pageant in Madison Square Garden. John Reed wrote the script, and the workers rehearsed at the Botto House.
In the first scene, the workers went on strike They ran down the central aisle of the audience of Madison Square Garden, which was a totally avant-garde idea in 1913, screaming, "Strike, strike," and the audience were on their feet, "Strike, strike," as if it was happening. And it was happening. Only this was New York, not Paterson.
The pageant was an artistic success, but it didn't make money.
And people started in the 5th month to go back to work. And the unity that they had achieved, which I think is their greatest achievement, growing out of their history, as I argue, and out of their intelligent understanding of their history, that began to fracture in the 5th month. And finally, there was a decision, not necessarily by the IWW, but by the local leaders, to call it off and go back.
The strike was lost not in Paterson, but in eastern Pennsylvania, where the biggest silk manufacturers had begun setting up shops in the 1890s so that they can keep silk production going.
Now, at these establishments, all right, this is coal country, anthracite coal. Most of the men work in the mines, all right? For example, in Paterson, all right, 56% of the strikers were men, okay? In Easton, Hazleton is the other one. I'm thinking of Hazleton. These are all women and girls, right? The daughters and wives of the coal miners. 91% were girls between the age of 14 and 18, all right? And you couldn't get all of the different branches of the industry in eastern Pennsylvania to go out on strike in support of Paterson, so that they're able to maintain production and profits. So that the strike in Paterson basically is a war of attrition.
For the IWW, the defeat of the 1913 Paterson silk strike marked the beginning of the end of their challenge to the AFL for leadership of the labor movement. 6 years later, IWW offices were raided by federal agents. Thousands of IWW organizers and socialists were rounded up in the Palmer raids, and hundreds were deported to Soviet Russia, including Big Bill Haywood. The defeat of the silk strike didn't end worker struggle in Paterson. In 1919, the weavers went out and won the 8-hour day. Nor did the 1913 strike kill the silk industry in Paterson.
The silk industry kept going. And what killed it was rayon and nylon and then the Depression. That's what killed it.
Many did pay a heavy price, including Pietro Botto, who allowed his house to be used as the strike headquarters.
He was fired from his position and no longer able to find employment again. They had 4 daughters who wanted to find work. When they went out and they heard that the name was Botto, they wanted no part of them because they thought that they were troublemakers. One daughter indeed changed her last name to Bata, and sure enough, was able to find a job.
Carrie Golzio never gave up the fight, becoming a successful textile organizer for the CIO in Paterson in 1937. Others, however, did.
Hannah Silverman, a 17-year-old who was, like Carrie Golzio, a strike leader, local silk weaver at 17, not unusual, and the leader at her mill, which I believe was the Westerhoff mill, and then turned out to be a really good speaker and did find herself addressing 25,000 people at the Bottle House and on the lawn out there, and going to jail 5 times, but always coming out and leading the parade to Madison Square Garden when they put on that show of the strike. And I, by luck, found her son. She had died, and he lived in Wayne when I was doing my research, and he was a lawyer. And he agreed to talk to me. And he told me a lot about his mom, the kind of person she was, but he didn't know any of the history. She hadn't told her son. And he remembered that she had once been called the black sheep of the family by a cousin, who she then didn't speak to for a year. But it struck him as a kid growing up, but he didn't know what to make of it. And he had heard the names Tresker, Haywood, Flynn, but that she had been a leader, he never knew. She died without telling her own son.